The blizzard began around 2:27 p.m. The flakes fell with unusual force, as if the sky had ruptured, casting a frozen silence over the small town of Jasper Hill, Wyoming. The trees vanished into the whiteness. Signs, cars, even footsteps faded seconds after they were taken, but no one immediately cared. Blizzards like this weren't uncommon. Classes continued until late afternoon, despite the sudden drop in temperature. The problem started when Noah didn't show up at the bus stop. Noah, 10 years old. Blonde, disheveled hair, eyes always downcast and a reserved gait. A different boy. He hardly spoke, didn't respond well to touch, and sometimes hid under his desk during breaks. But he was kind. His teacher said he had a unique way of seeing the world. He would listen to the wind and smile. He would notice the rustling of leaves before looking up. It was as if he had his own code, invisible to others. That day, however, he disappeared. He left the school through the back, as he always did, but he never made it home. The minutes turned to panic. Mom called the school, then the police, then all the neighbors. In less than an hour, patrol cars began combing the city. The problem was the snow. It didn't forgive mistakes, and every second counted. Tires spun on the hills. Radios failed in the humidity. Helicopters couldn't climb because of the 70 km/h winds. Drones flew low, but the white landscape swallowed everything. The city stopped. The hardware store closed, the bar emptied. Everyone went out to look for the boy. They knocked on doors, opened barns, searched trails. Parents held their own children in fear. But nothing. No footprints, no sound, no sign. The snow extinguished even hope. Have you ever had the feeling that the whole world is looking in the wrong place? It was then that someone saw him, alone, on the road opposite the search center. A hooded figure walking slowly, wearing a dark overcoat, his head bowed. He carried no radio or map, just an old flashlight strapped to his waist and a wooden stick he used to tap the snow ahead. He walked silently. He didn't look at anyone. "It's the old man from the cabin," murmured one of the residents. "Frank Dillard." Some young people laughed. Others walked away. Since leaving the military, Frank had lived isolated in a small wooden building in the mountains, far from everything and everyone. He spoke to no one. He was seen at the market once a month, buying only coffee, matches, and flour. Children were afraid of him. Adults considered him disturbed. But what almost no one knew is that this old man had led expeditions into territories where no radar worked. He was a veteran of the U.S. Arctic forces. Trained to survive in the dark, the cold and absolute silence, Frank didn't ask any questions. He just looked up at the sky, then back at the trees. He ran his hand along the trunk of a leaning pine tree. Then he turned away from the group. While everyone else was searching south, he headed north. No one followed, no one cared. But what he saw there, no drone could see. The snow seemed uniform, but he knew it wasn't. A broken twig out of the ordinary. A curve in the ice where the wind wasn't blowing. A slight incline in the trail, signs imperceptible to the naked eye. But Frank carried within him an old pain, a trauma that kept him awake on the coldest mornings, a mistake he had sworn never to repeat. Something inside him told him that boy was not lost. He was hiding, but hidden from what and why? Stay with me, because what this old man is about to discover may change the way you see silence. He walked away slowly, as if he didn't want to attract attention but knew exactly where he was going. His old leather boots sank into the thick snow, but his steps didn't falter. Frank Dillard wasn't young anymore. His knees creaked under the weight of years, and the cold pierced his spine like a knife. But his gaze remained steady, fixed on the details no one else could see. The wind pushed branches in every direction, and the forest seemed to whisper words only he understood. Each gust of air brought a memory that never healed. It was the same way 30 years earlier, a similar night with the same kind of unbearable silence, the same city, the same desperate search for a child who didn't understand the world in the normal way. Back then the boy was his son, Elijah. 7 years old with green eyes and a strange way of telling stories with gestures. Frank had just returned from a mission. He was tired. A 10-minute delay in picking him up from school had cost the boy his life. By the time they found Elijah, it was too late. He was huddled in a rock crevice next to an injured bird, trying to protect it with his own body. The snow covered him before any help could reach him. Frank never forgave himself. He left the service, sold everything, and built his life in solitude. The only company he kept was the wind and the invisible footprints left by time. He knew he was no longer considered useful. In town they called him the weirdo from the cabin, the old ghost, the crazy man on the ice. But he had learned one thing over the years. A person's true worth isn't measured by their appearance or the whispers of others. It's measured by their listening. And in that moment he heard something others ignored. He stopped in front of a leaning tree. The branches were broken on one side only, as if they had been pushed from the inside out. Below, the snow seemed to have sunk slightly, forming a kind of furrow. Frank touched the ground with stiffened fingers. It wasn't a clear path. It was a reflex, an involuntary deviation, the kind of detail no one notices, unless they've experienced the same kind of loss. Back there, the rescuers were still arguing in circles. Drones flew on automated routes. Sniffer dogs circled their own tracks. And someone was still laughing at Frank, pointing out his old clothes, his slow pace, his stubbornness. "That old man's going to freeze to death," one of the officers said. But Frank no longer heard those voices. He heard other things. He listened to what the forest was trying to say. Along the way, the sounds of the city faded. The increasingly biting cold made the metal of his flashlight creak. His hands trembled, but he didn't stop. At one point, he knelt before a snow-covered rock. No one in their right mind would do that in that temperature, but he felt something, an impression on the surface, as if something light had slipped there, perhaps a child's backpack. A tiny touch, almost unnoticeable. And then, for the first time, his eyes welled up. Because that backpack, or what was left of it, reminded him so much of one he'd bought years ago in Salt Lake City. Dark blue, with a little rocket embroidered on it. The pain he thought he'd buried rose like an avalanche inside him. But he didn't run from it. On the contrary, he leaned into it, because the pain, though cruel, pointed the way. And he knew that, on that kind of journey, suffering is the price paid by those who insist on seeing what others avoid. The trail faded and returned. Sometimes it was a mark on the tree, other times a bent branch. At one point, Frank found a tuft of white fur attached to a splinter of wood. A wild rabbit, perhaps. Or a fox. It would explain a lot. Autistic children like Elijah, like Noah, have an inexplicable attraction to small movements, animals, sounds, flashing lights. And suddenly, it all made sense. The boy wasn't running from someone. He was following something. Frank continued, even with his feet damp and his face burning from the cold. At that point, any other man would have turned back, but he refused, not just for Noah, but for everything he had lost. For the chance to turn tragedy into redemption. And as the snow fell even harder, and the world seemed to grow silent, Frank saw in the distance a shadow move, low, hunched, like someone dragging themselves along. He stopped. He took a deep breath and moved cautiously on. Because there are times when you can't make mistakes, and this was one of them. Write in the comments, "There are things that only silence reveals," and we will go together until the end of this journey. The sirens continued to blare, but they no longer produced any reaction. The entire city had plunged into a state of collective numbness. Time seemed doubled, stretched like a string about to snap. Some residents began returning home, heads down, as if their hope had frozen with the snow. Outside the hospital, the nurse accompanying Noah's mother held her hands in hers, trying to warm them. But the woman could no longer feel her fingers, not from the cold, not from the despair. The last thing she managed to say before fainting was, "He doesn't know how to get back." On the emergency radio, the officers tried to organize what remained of the operation, but each sentence was accompanied by impersonal statistics and projections. Feels like temperature, 18 degrees. Child survival without thermal shelter, estimated 2 hours. It was as if they had forgotten that this wasn't just an operation, but the life of a boy who saw the world through different eyes. A boy who might be scared or maybe just too curious. Noah's father, previously restrained, was now screaming. He pounded the dashboard of the police car with both hands, disfigured with rage and helplessness. The tears were gone. He'd spent them in the first 2 hours. Now all that remained was numbness, that feeling that creeps in when you no longer know whether you're living or just resisting. And while everyone was slowly beginning to accept the worst, a nearly forgotten presence walked alone among the trees. Frank approached a frozen stream. The water beneath was still moving, but the crust of ice mirrored the overcast sky. He knelt with effort, his left knee cracked. A dull pain shot up his thigh. He ignored it. He ran his fingers over the white surface. He felt a slight change in the texture of the snow, an almost melting. It wasn't natural, it was recent. Like the faint warmth left by a small body. He bent down lower. He smelled the damp, the moss. And then, without understanding where it came from, a memory tore through the silence. Elijah, still small, hiding under the living room table, with a kitten wrapped in a blanket. "He was cold, Dad," he'd said then, "and I just wanted him to stay with me." Frank pushed the image away, swallowed hard. What he saw ahead, however, brought the memory back with a vengeance. A thread of colourful fabric, almost covered in ice, attached to an exposed root. It was part of a child's backpack. Frank stood still for a second. His chest heaved. His wrinkled face seemed to crack even more. But he didn't cry. Not now. He picked up the scrap of fabric, pressed it to his chest and whispered something inaudible. Then he struggled to his feet and continued. He knew he was close. He felt it. Not with his eyes, but with his mind, and with something deeper. Guilt. Ahead he found a fallen tree. The trunk was covered in a thin layer of snow, but beneath it were marks, not of feet, but of something or someone who had slipped or crawled. It was as if Noah had tried to shield himself from the wind, using the tree as shelter. Beside it, the tiny footprints of a wild animal, a squirrel perhaps, or a rabbit. And suddenly, everything made sense. Frank understood. The boy didn't run away. He simply followed whatever caught his attention, something alive. Something that made sense within his silent world, a defenseless animal, and perhaps in that moment what moved him wasn't fear, but compassion. It was then that Frank stopped again. The wind had died for a moment, and a faint sound drifted through the forest, almost a muffled moan. He turned slowly. He shone his flashlight between two rocks. Nothing, but the sound came again. Fainter, closer. He crouched down and listened. He felt air escape through a narrow gap between branches and ice. He leaned his face closer, and there, hidden in a hollow beneath a mound of snow and leaves, was Noah, curled up, trembling, his face pale and his eyes half closed. Beside him, pressed against his chest, was a small, dark-furred squirrel, still alive. The boy wasn't crying, he just stared, quiet, almost in a trance. Frank removed his coat, covered them both, and said softly, "You are not alone anymore." Noah didn't answer. But his previously aimless eyes lingered for a moment on the old man's, and in that silent exchange, something was complete, something that even words couldn't grasp. Frank carried him in his arms, his icy body feeling as heavy as lead. Each step back was a challenge. The pain in his shoulders, the stiffness in his muscles, the accumulated exhaustion of decades. But he didn't stop. Even when his legs threatened to give way, even when his chest felt like it would rupture from the effort, he just kept moving forward, one step at a time, 1 second at a time. When he emerged from the forest, no one noticed him immediately. The town was still silent. Radios were too busy with codes, flashlights turned away. But then a child pointed, then another. And slowly all eyes turned to that ancient figure covered in snow with an unconscious boy in his arms. There was a moment of astonishment, then murmurs, and then a shout. "It's him. It's the boy." The father ran. He nearly tripped in his haste. The mother, still weak, was pushed in a wheelchair to the front of the hospital. People parted, and for the first time in years, someone applauded Frank Dillard, but he didn't react. He simply handed the boy to the paramedic, touched his face one last time and stepped back. He walked slowly to a nearby bench, sat down, and took a deep breath. His eyes filled with tears again. But this time, it wasn't guilt. It was relief. A local guard officer approached, shyly, as if he didn't quite know what to say. How did you find him?" Frank looked ahead, as if observing something much more distant than what was before his eyes, and he replied in the same calm voice as always. "Because I was trained to hear what no one else hears, and he was calling me, even in silence. Write in the comments, silence also speaks." This sentence may seem simple now, but when everything falls silent, it becomes a beacon. And there is something that has not yet been revealed about this story, something that no one expected to hear that very day. The wind had changed. It was denser, sharper, as if the forest were aware of what had just happened. Frank remained there for a few seconds, kneeling, holding the boy against his chest. The silence was so absolute that he could hear the sound of his own breathing, mixed with the slight tremor of the small body in his arms. Noah was conscious, but he didn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on some point that wasn't there, and yet there was something different in that look, a kind of silent surrender, as if, for the first time, he had found a place where he didn't need to explain himself. Frank pulled the blanket tighter over the boy, adjusted his coat around them both and began to stand. His muscles protested, his spine creaked, his right knee gave out for a second, and he nearly fell under the boy's weight, but he steadied himself. He took a deep breath, and took the first step out of the icy shelter. The snow continued to fall, now in thick, heavy flakes that clung to his clothes and eyelashes. Visibility was low. The return would be even more difficult, but Frank didn't hesitate. He knew this kind of terrain. He knew how ice deceives, how the forest tries to spin you in circles. What he carried now wasn't just a fragile body. It was a promise that could never fail. The way back seemed twice as long. The footprints he had left were already covered, but Frank used his memory as a compass. He recognized the bend of a branch, the subtle slope of a rock, the way the wind gathered against certain trunks. It was as if his mind had recorded every microdata of that journey without realizing it. The pain in his legs increased with each step. The temperature punished his lungs. At times, he found himself leaning against a tree, breathing heavily, his eyes bleary with exhaustion. But just looking at the boy nestled against his chest was enough for an ancient strength to surge from within, a strength he thought he had lost, along with his own son. At one point, something nearly snapped inside him. A spasm in his back sent him falling to his knees. The boy slipped slightly, and Frank had to use his left arm to hold him steady. The world spun. He bit his lip to keep from screaming. The metallic taste of blood spread through his mouth, but he didn't complain. He just whispered through clenched teeth, "You're going to get out of here, even if I can't." And then he stood, one unsteady step, another firm one, and he continued on. The blizzard intensified, and the forest seemed thicker. Shadows blurred against the branches, but memory remained his guide. He passed the frozen stream, a clearing where he had left a mark with his stick, then a broken log where he had found Noah's first sign. Everything was where it should be, and finally he saw the road. But no one was waiting for him there. The rescue team had been diverted to another area, the drones were being collected, and the last volunteers were already returning home, their faces downcast and their clothes soaked. The town had lost hope, and it was at that moment, when no one else believed, that Frank appeared in the mist, walking slowly, covered in snow up to his shoulders, with the boy in his arms. The first to see him was a young Girl Scout carrying a box of emergency flashlights. She stopped, widened her eyes, dropped the box and ran screaming to the adults. One paramedic turned, then another, and within seconds everyone was rushing toward the lone figure approaching like a scene ripped from another time. Frank said nothing. He simply handed Noah into the hands of the first responder. The boy was immediately wrapped in thermal blankets, examined with flashlights, and loaded into the ambulance. Doctors shouted orders, parents cried, neighbors hugged. But Frank walked away. He sat down in the snow, his hands on his knees, his head bowed, His body begged to pass out, but he was still breathing. That's when a detail caught everyone's attention. As the paramedics tended to Noah, the boy, for the first time since being found, raised his right hand and aimed. Not at the ambulance, not at his parents, but at the hunched old man sitting by the side of the road. Everyone stopped. The gesture was subtle but charged with meaning. And what happened next made time stand still. The boy, still weak, took something from his jacket's inside pocket, a small folded sheet of paper covered in ice. When they opened it, they saw a drawing. On it was the silhouette of a man holding a lantern with an animal beside him and a child in his arms. At the top, written in childish, irregular handwriting, was a single word: heard. No one understood right away, but for Frank, it was everything. Our boy, who almost never spoke, almost never wrote, had left a mark, a symbol, an acknowledgement. That drawing wasn't just a thank you, it was a bridge between two silent worlds that had finally met. The applause began timidly, then it grew louder. A police officer who had always ignored Frank doffed his hat. One of the paramedics bowed his head in respect. The boy's mother, still trembling, made a point of getting up from the stretcher and walking over to the old man. With teary eyes, she extended her hand to him, but Frank hesitated. He looked at her, then at the boy inside the ambulance, and then, slowly, he accepted the gesture. It was the first time anyone from that town had touched Frank affectionately in over 20 years. But that moment, though powerful, wasn't the most memorable of the night. Something even bigger was about to happen, something no one could have predicted. Because not all the faces that appeared there were unfamiliar to Frank, and among them there was one who would completely change the city's perception of him. Write in the comments, silence is also an answer. This story still holds a hidden truth that could transform everything you thought you knew until now. The applause continued to echo down the snow-covered main street, but Frank didn't seem to hear it. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a kind of emotion he hadn't named in decades. The crowd parted respectfully, as if the man they'd previously avoided had suddenly become a sacred figure. The old man from the cabin, the forgotten man, the lonely stranger hardly anyone greeted at the market or the pharmacy, now he was seen with new eyes. And yet, he remained with his head bowed, as if still carrying a guilt that the applause couldn't dissolve. Noah was rushed into the hospital. The doctor on duty shouted instructions, while a nurse tried to keep his vital signs under control. The boy's mother, still kneeling on the icy sidewalk, cried soundlessly, as if all the pent-up pain had transformed into a relief too heavy for words. The trembling father simply leaned against a lamppost and wept, his forehead pressed against the iron. It was the kind of breakdown you don't choose. It just happens. Meanwhile, one detail went unnoticed by most. At the end of the street, beneath one of the old school's awnings, a man watched the scene with his arms crossed. Tall, robust, clean-shaven, and steady-eyed. He had a badge pinned to his jacket and a look that seemed to weigh decades. When the first officers noticed his presence, silence fell again. It was Colonel Holgraves, retired for almost 10 years, now a tactical strategy advisor for the state government. No one expected to see him there, and no one immediately understood why he was walking so precisely toward Frank. The veteran was still sitting on the same bench where he had rested his body, his hands resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on a point that didn't exist. When he sensed Holgraves approaching, he looked up just enough to recognize him. "I didn't think you were still around," Frank murmured, his voice low, almost breathless. "I never really left," the colonel replied, stopping in front of him. "And you keep saving lives even when no one asks you to." The sentence hung in the air like a compliment and an open wound at the same time. Frank pressed his lips together. For a moment, he looked as if he might respond, but then he stopped. Holgraves pulled something from his pocket. It was a small worn medal attached to a faded blue ribbon. It fluttered in the wind like an old keepsake. A few younger soldiers approached, trying to understand what was happening. "Most people here don't know who you are, Frank, and it's our fault. Your story has been buried in classified reports, erased missions, and decades of silence. But today, That ends. Frank frowned in confusion. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Operation Halo 17, the Arctic. The night you lost 10 comrades. And even though you were wounded, you dragged 4 of them out of the danger zone in the dark with a broken compass and a wet map. I'm talking about the time you walked for over 30 hours with an unconscious soldier on your back because the helicopter couldn't land. I'm talking about what you did, and no one ever told you. Frank closed his eyes. The images came to him all at once. Snow, blood, muffled voices, the metallic smell in the air, and the screams that have kept him awake for hours since. That wasn't meant to be remembered, he whispered. That was a mistake. That was courage, Halgraves replied without hesitation, and now it's time for everyone to know. Without asking permission, the colonel turned to the crowd still surrounding the hospital entrance. He raised his voice, firm and deep. This man saved a child's life today, but what he did before that, no one here knows, and it's time they did. A few cell phones were raised, 1 or 2 began filming, the news spread, local journalists rushed in, and as the flashbulbs began to flash, Frank shrank back a little, uncomfortable. He'd never wanted fame, never wanted the spotlight. But there was something different about that moment. It was as if, for the first time, the weight he'd carried on his shoulders was being shared with the world. The mayor, upon hearing what had happened, rushed in with his city representative's sash still draped over his coat. He tried to approach, tried to make a speech, but no one paid much attention. Everyone wanted to hear Frank, but he didn't speak. He remained silent, he just watched, he felt. And it was at that moment, in the midst of that public commotion, that a child approached. It was a girl, about 8 years old, yellow scarf, red gloves. She walked slowly, a white envelope between her fingers. She stopped in front of Frank. She looked him straight in the eye and held out the envelope. "It's Noah's," he said softly. "He asked me to deliver it." Frank took the paper with trembling hands. He opened it carefully. Inside there was only a single sheet of paper drawn in pencil. There were 2 faces, a boy and a grey-haired man. Both were holding a small animal between them. In the bottom corner, a sentence written in large crooked letters, "You understood my silence." Frank couldn't hold it back. The tears came all at once. They fell heavy, silently. He closed his eyes, pressed the drawing to his chest, and lay there. The crowd fell silent. There was nothing more to say. But what no one imagined is that Frank's story still held a revelation that would only come to light days later, a truth that would forever change the way that city viewed the heroes among them. Write in the comments. There are stories that only silence tells. You will understand why. Frank awoke to the sound of small footsteps on the porch. They were light, almost timid, as if the wood knew someone lived inside who had long since grown accustomed to silence. Instinctively he grabbed his coat, pulled on his boots, and opened the door. There were no shouts, no press. Just 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, holding a tray of cake and a cardboard box filled with letters, folded with colorful ribbons. They said nothing. They just smiled, placed everything on the porch bench, and waved goodbye. Frank watched in silence. He stood still until the figures disappeared down the snowy trail. Then he picked up the box and went inside. Inside, each envelope seemed to have been made with the kind of care you don't see anymore. Some bore short phrases. "You saved my friend." "My grandmother said you're a warrior." Others bore drawings of lanterns, squirrels, and boys hugging. One, signed by a girl named Ellie, read, "If I ever get lost, I want you to come find me too." Frank carefully set everything down on the table. He ran his hand slowly over the worn wood, marked by years of solitude. This was the same table where he used to have lunch with Elijah, the same one where he left the last plate served the day his son disappeared. He'd never had the courage to remove that plate, but now for the first time he picked it up. He washed it silently. He dried it with a new cloth, and he put it away. That's when he looked at the living room wall. Next to Elijah's old photograph, the only one left, taken at a picnic in 1991, there was now a new drawing, The one of the boy in the forest, the one with the old man in the black cloak and a lit lantern. The two images side by side formed something indescribable. It was as if past and present had recognized each other, as if there had finally been some kind of reconciliation with time. But there was something that still needed to be done. Frank pulled on his thickest coat, the same one he'd worn during the rescue mission. He pulled out an old folded yellowed envelope from the bottom of a toolbox. Inside was a letter, handwritten, never sent. It was for Elijah. He reread it with tearful eyes, as if trying to touch the past with his fingertips. Then he folded it carefully, tucked it into his coat pocket, and left. The city watched him differently now, not with fear, nor with pity, but with something rarer, reverence. As he passed through the square, a woman held his hand for a few seconds without saying anything. A mechanic took off his cap and bowed his head. A mailman stopped his bicycle, gave a thumbs up, and continued on his way. Everyone knew Frank had become more than just a veteran. He was now a symbol, not the kind carved in marble, but the kind who live among us and, from time to time, save us. His destination was the old town cemetery, the place where Elijah had been buried. Frank hadn't been there in years. He was afraid of what he would feel, afraid of finding the tomb intact but his heart still in pieces. But today was different. For the first time, he felt he could walk there without being destroyed inside. He arrived slowly. The gate creaked as always. The trail was covered in ice, but he didn't slip. He knew every step, every stone, every shadow among the cypress trees. He stopped before the headstone bearing his son's name. Elijah Dillard, 1984-1994. Son with watchful eyes and a light soul. He took a deep breath. He sat down on the cold ground and took the letter from his pocket. "I should have brought this to you sooner," he said, almost in a whisper. "But I didn't know if I deserved it." He stood there for a while. He read the letter aloud. He cried again. Then he fell silent. The kind of silence that no longer hurts, but heals. He left the letter folded on the stone, secured it with a dry twig, and stood up. On the way out, he passed the small chapel that was rarely used, but this time it was open. Inside, there was a makeshift mural of newspaper clippings. In the center, a headline, "Veteran rediscovers meaning of life by saving autistic boy in forest." And, next to the headline, a photo of Frank holding Noah in his arms, covered by the same military blanket. But there was something even more surprising attached to the mural. An official document signed by the state government. It stated that Frank Dillard would receive the Civilian Merit Medal for bravery, and that a new trail in the city park would be named after him. Trail of Silence. Frank read it all slowly. He didn't smile, but his eyes shone with another kind of light, one that comes when pain finds purpose, when loneliness becomes a legacy. As I left the chapel, the sky began to open. It was still cold, but the first golden rays broke through the clouds, illuminating the white rooftops and frozen trees as if each leaf were touched by something sacred. And in that moment, as he descended back to his cabin, one thing became clear. Even those who spend their lives silent will one day be heard. Because when the truth comes laden with scars, it finds a way to become a voice, even if silently. If you've made it this far, perhaps this story touched you on a level beyond words. And if it did, it was already worth every second. Sometimes all we need is a quiet moment, and someone willing to walk through the snow for us, even if no one can see. If this content resonated with you, leave a "I hear the silence" in the comments. It's the most beautiful way to show that you stuck it out until the end, and that you felt the weight and beauty of this journey. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, filled with soul, truth, and meaning, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot coming, and I want to share it all with you, always with the same honest, open-hearted conversation. Oh, and if this video made you think or feel anything different, leave a like. It helps more than it seems. There's a video here that complements this journey in an unexpected way. Click and stay with me there. You'll understand why.